afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope you're going to enjoy and participate as we get our Tech Talk underway today for Monash University. My name's Jon Faine and I'm a graduate of Monash University a very long time ago, far too long ago. And I think they were rather glad to see the back of me actually when I left, but there you go, that was a long time ago. Things were very different. First, we'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and we'd also like to pay our respects to their elders past and present. And I personally would like to express my impatience for a treaty between the traditional owners, the First Nations people of this land, and those of us who have since arrived and made it into what it is now, which is something we should be proud of. But until there's a treaty, it's a personal view of mine, and I make a point of it each time and saying, I think it's something we really need to do. Our Tech Talks are part of a series of 7. They're brought to you by the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is doing groundbreaking work that's getting attention all over the world. There's a series of 7. You can have a look at their website to participate. There's another one coming up in a couple of weeks. And this is very much about participation. It's about you being involved. It's about you joining in, as well as the experts having a chance to tell us what they're learning and where they're taking us as they do their research. And I'll introduce you to them in a moment. Today's theme is about the changing role of the home. What is a smart wife? Are predictions of the end of the office, are they wildly exaggerated? What about the prospect of losing the distinction between your work life and your home life? Does that leave you personally threatened? And are we really being asked to choose between our health and our privacy? Each of our experts will address those issues, and we're very much looking forward to your contributions. And thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. I have an anthropologist, a sociologist, and a futurist, and that's not the start of a joke about people walking into a bar. Sarah Pink, Yolande Strengers, and Jathan Sadowski are going to give us the benefit of their research, their expertise, their insights, and their wisdom during the course of these proceedings. The format's very straightforward. I'll start off having a chat to each of them, Sarah first in just a moment, and then as we get the 3 of them, we hear from them individually, we'll hear from them collectively, and then we'll be working in your questions as we go. And we hope that by the time we have used up an hour of your life that you'll never get back again, that you've come away with something that you didn't know before, and we'll all be the better for it as well. Now, Sarah, can I start with you first, because you are our resident expert and with much wisdom and much background working with industry as well. What do anthropologists tell us about where we are now in this pandemic and the changed world it's given us?
Thanks very much, Jon. I think at the moment we need to wait to hear what the anthropologists have to say once they've done their real in-depth research. I think as an anthropologist, certain things I can be sure of. One of them is that the pandemic is going to change the way that we live in our homes in different ways, in different cultural contexts and different social contexts around the world. People live in their homes in very different ways. And the relationship between being at home and being outdoors, again, are really differently constituted and experienced in different cultures and different countries. So I think at the moment we need to kind of reflect on this idea that we don't actually know what the impact is going to be. And we won't be able to know until it's been really thoroughly and properly researched. And that we know also that it's going to be very differently patterned across the world. We're already seeing diverse experiences just from the kind of the anecdotal messages that we're seeing on social media and the news and this kind of journalistic portraits that we've been seeing of people's experiences of living through the pandemic. It's very different.
We'll come to some of those overseas experiences in a second, but what do you make then of some of the incredibly confident predictions that different people are making, where they're, dare I say it, putting themselves right out there and saying, oh, it's the end of the office, we'll never go back to the way things used to be?
Well, I'll start by saying, yes, we will never go back to exactly the way things used to be, but that's just a common state of being human. We never actually go back to how anything was before. We're always moving forward in time. So yes, obviously things will be different. But I'm doubtful that we're going to see a change as dramatic as you know, people never going back to the office. I'm sure that many people will be clamoring to get back to their offices. And so as I said, let's be cautious, let's be careful, let's look at what people are really doing, let's look at what organisations are really doing, and actually understand how both people and organisations and governments weave their way through this situation in which there's still so much uncertainty. I think that we began with this incredible uncertainty, I think, which was very kind of stressful and difficult for people, because we usually live our lives in such a way that we more or less know what's going to happen tomorrow, we more or less know what's going to happen next week, we more or less know when we're going to have our holidays and how we're going to celebrate our birthdays, and then suddenly all of that is absolutely disrupted. And some of those things have maybe started to settle down a bit more now, but that doesn't mean that our future is particularly more certain, because we don't know what kind of crisis might happen next. I'm not trying to be dystopian, but we've been through a climate crisis and bushfire crisis here in Australia. Then we didn't, then this current health crisis we couldn't have imagined. So let's start thinking a little bit about acknowledging the fact that we can't necessarily predict our futures. We can't know what's going to happen next, and we shouldn't think we can be confident about it. We can only know what's possible.
Home, for many of us, when we have an office and we go out to work, we leave home to go to work. And that's not just a physical thing, it's also a mental, a psychological distancing between our home life and our work persona. If we're working from home, how do we renegotiate that? And what does that then do to home? Is it less of a sanctuary because it's now also where we work?
I think that it mixes up our home and our work situations a lot. But I think we need to remember that a lot of people have been working from home already for quite a long time. I'm not sure that it's working from home makes a big difference. Yes, there are big changes related to that, but it's very much about also considering the conditions under which we're working from home now. So people with young kids are working from home whilst trying to homeschool young kids. We're also working from home in circumstances where we can't go out and meet our friends in a cafe for a coffee or go out for lunch somewhere and actually get into a different environment. So it's not only about a shift towards working from home, it's actually a very kind of complex shift. And
the home as sanctuary, can you address that? Because many of us, you leave work, and I mean, I'll tell you a very quick anecdote. For over 20 years, I worked in an office in a public role on the radio at the ABC. I would start work at 5:30 in the morning. I have a pen on a string, those pens on a rope. I would arrive at work, and the first thing I do is I put the pen on. I'm at work, I've got the pen on. The last thing I would do when I leave, I would take the pen off. And once the pen is off, it didn't matter what happened. If someone said, "Oh, can I just have a word?" I'd say, "No, the pen's off, that's it." And that was a mental thing in my head as well as a physical thing. The pen was the symbol. You can't do that if you work from home. You're constantly at where you work because you're at home, and people now think, "Oh, well, you're at home, you're at work. I can call you anytime. I can ask you to do something anytime. There's no boundary anymore."
Yes, but I think some of those changes are already taking place in many people's lives anyway. So some of my work has been around doing research into people's everyday morning routines at home. And so many people will look at their email and their WhatsApp messages in bed before they even get out of bed. And they'll also check messages last thing at night too. So this kind of seepage of the relationship between work and home, kind of seeping into each other in interesting ways, was already happening. This crisis has kind of intensified a lot of that. But I think what's potentially more interesting is to look at some of those continuing trends, where it represents and evolves some of the things that we've already been doing, rather than seeing it simply as a big disruptive change. The other point is that home and work are much more mixed up in other ways as well. Many people actually go to work in other people's homes. So just think about a plumber, an electrician, a social worker, community nurse, all kinds of therapists. Many people's jobs actually involve going to other people's homes, logistics workers, delivery workers. So many things around the home, the way people work in relation to homes in those contexts are changing as well. One of the projects that I've just beginning in the UK with a professor of social work, Harry Ferguson, is actually looking at how child protection social workers are able to work online from their own homes, trying to somehow simulate home visits in their service users' homes, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And involves using technologies in very new ways for that particular profession, which relies very, very much on the face-to-face encounter. So I think there are some contexts in which we can actually study and see exactly how those new situations are playing out, and we can definitely learn from them. But we shouldn't assume that we know what we're going to find out yet, because this situation is new and emerging.
In the workplace, there's a lot of the informal, the subtle, the incidental that takes place that's part of the creative process. And I mean creative not just in the sense of the arts, but all work involves creativity. Even if you're drafting trust deeds or doing auditing, there's still creativity involved. There's original thinking. It's what distinguishes us, is it not, from monkeys and computers? But how do you still maintain then all that subtle interactivity that's part of the informal when you're isolated and not working in a group?
I think with great difficulty is the answer to that question. And I would also say that, working from home in these circumstances, precisely, we're losing the social, we're losing, and even if it's not about being in the office, it's that going out for a coffee, that having a chat, having lunch with colleagues. So we lose that kind of informal and that whole social environment around us. So I think that's why it's difficult to equate what's happening now to the kinds of future scenarios around working from home and anything else that kind of emanates from the idea of being in your home much more, or being in your neighbourhood much more, because the social has actually been extracted from that whole equation. And we are humans, we are social creatures, and that's what shapes and forms us in the way we live. So very hard to actually see how what's happening now will continue, because the social is going to be something which I very much hope anyway will be added back in very soon.
Well, it's vital for many people. In fact, many lasting friendships, dare I say it, even relationships and the like, are formed through those informal connections. I'll come back to you shortly, Sarah, and to Yolande in just a moment. Robert's written in, working from home has a number of positives. If a great proportion of the workforce is able to do so, then it raises equity questions, says Roberto. Some people will have the housing style, the space, the technology to do so productively, and others will not. And it's an equity question for him. Will the onus be shifted to employers to pay for renovations or refits to accommodate specific needs for people who are required to work from home and can't afford to do it? It's a really interesting question. You can tax deduct your home office. Can you tax deduct even more if you're required to work from home? Not sure what Josh Frydenberg, the Federal Treasurer, would have to say. And Penny has written in the disability space, she writes, it's been said by many people that they've been asking for accommodation working from home for ages. The request was declined. It was always too hard. So might this pandemic and working from home be a directive that improves the disability folks' working life into the future? It's a really interesting question for an important and often ignored and overlooked component part of the community. So we'll work that in as we get our conversation going as well. Yolande, from your point of view, you've got this concept of the smart wife that you've developed in your research. First of all, explain to us, because for many of us that's a novel concept, and explain what it is and then how it's changing because of the working from home response to the pandemic.
Sure, thanks, Jon. So the smart wife is essentially a type of technology designed for the home which tries to behave like a wife in some way. So it's a concept that Jenny Kennedy and I have developed through a book that we're releasing later this year with MIT Press. And it refers to technologies like digital voice assistants, home robots, various other kinds of social robots like Pepper you may have heard of, and even sex robots that take up the caregiving, the housekeeping, the sort of social and emotional jobs that were typically performed by a wife, primarily a wife from the 1950s in a sort of Anglo sense of the term. So we look at these technologies and how they're sort of intended to perform this role of the wife in the home. I've been looking at a couple of them in relation to the pandemic, like Alexa, for example, and Google Home, who have sort of stepped in to offer us advice on the coronavirus and to provide, early diagnosis information, for example, and help us out with sort of health information and what have you. But one of the ongoing criticisms with smart wives is unfortunately, they're not wives, and they're not able to really perform a lot of the jobs that, they're intended to. So it's a little bit of a kind of marketing spin, if you like, and not necessarily as helpful as we would like them to be in picking up many of those jobs and responsibilities wives typically performed. And for most households now, those jobs are difficult to allocate, and it can cause sort of tension in the home about whose responsibility it is to do now the roles of the wife from previously. I guess the issue that raises now then is that there's a whole lot of extra work going on in the home, as we've been talking about. And there's a question of who takes up that extra work. And there's more housekeeping to do, there's more shopping to do, there's more cooking to do, cleaning, looking after children, looking after people who might be ill. So there's a whole range of labours, and the early evidence around that suggests that it is women who are doing proportionally more of that work in the home at the moment, picking up that domestic slack, if you like, as caring and workplace responsibilities enter the home.
But isn't there also a realisation by, dare I say it, a lot of the men who are now at home during the day when they're not used to it, that there's a whole lot of stuff going on that they never knew about, and it's forcing them to address the inequality of the workload, the domestic workload. And in particular in families where both are working, where both partners are working, one has added on a lot of the domestic duties and domestic work to their paid external work, and suddenly the inequality of that has become glaringly obvious.
Absolutely, that's a more optimistic way of looking at it, I think, and I think that's an opportunity that we could certainly be in these situations and reassess and really become aware of all the work that kind of happens around us from the perspective of different genders. There is some early research already coming out, though, that shows that's not necessarily the case, and the other alternative is that this could reinforce those stereotypes, that sort of gender roles of who has traditionally done those labours. And there's another number of reasons for that. Women are more likely to work part-time, for example. They're more likely to earn less than men, so they may feel they have to sort of do more in other ways, or that if you're in a heterosexual relationship, that the man's job is somehow more important because they're paid more or they work more or what have you. So I think there are a number of other considerations that could play into that. And again, it's another area, like Sarah said before, where we do need more research to kind of understand what this is going to look like and mean, both for the home and also for the workplace, because obviously our ability to work at the moment is compromised by everything that's happening in the home. And if one gender's kind of more involved in all the home activities, and that's obviously going to disproportionately impact their ability to work.
I love it when researchers say we need more research on this. It's always so reassuring, Yolande. A couple of questions. Well, one of them anticipates where we were about to go, so I'll use Rashinda's question for you. Some people have thrived and others have struggled on an individual level. Is it our personalities, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, that's had an effect on how well you respond, how well you adapt to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not something I've thought about in a great deal, but I'm sure obviously there are, as Sarah was saying before, many, many different perspectives. It's to be very careful here not to generalise everybody's experiences. And there's also scenarios where, for example, women have been the ones to go back into the workplace and men are staying at home. But certainly, yeah, obviously people's personalities, their circumstances are all going to impact on how well they're able to cope, whether they live in a tiny apartment, in a kind of outer suburb, or whether they live in a beautiful suburb with parks and trees to kind of keep them buoyed during the day. All these things I think are going to factor on people's experiences during the pandemic and how they're able to cope. And Jon, if I can,
yep, go ahead.
I also wanted to pick up on Roberto's question, I think it was earlier, about the equity impacts that he was raising, because I do think that he sort of talking about, if I remember it, sort of the technology requirements that might, how people might have different access to internet and technology and what have you. And there's other aspects too here, I think, about the digital housekeeping that might be going on in terms of even like, today setting up for this call and figuring out, we were all working out what microphones we should use and how to transform our homes into studios and what have you. There's all this kind of extra labour going on, and I think that's also interesting to kind of think about from this gendered perspective. So even though women might be, well, the early evidence shows, more likely to do more of the housekeeping, our past research with technology shows that men are actually more likely to do the digital housekeeping. So if we have all these extra equipment requirements coming into the home, there may be kind of a gendered impact there in terms of, who's setting up various technologies and making sure they're all running appropriately. Who rings, the internet company, for example, when things break down, or tries to reset the modem or make the television talk to the phone or whatever. So these are all kinds of parts of the equity question as well, and who does those kinds of labours.
Well, it's certainly at the cutting edge. So thank you, Yolande. And my first question to Jathan has actually been anticipated, and I think put far better by Mark than I would. And let's get to the tech side of things, Jathan, and then we'll come back to some of the questions that are coming through. And you're welcome to add yours as well. Mark's written in, I'd be interested in hearing about the increasing reliance on commercial tech platforms that enable forms of working at home, but for some. The development and extension of the monitoring tools enables employers to track your home activity in increasingly detailed ways. So suddenly, and there are offices where there are keyboard monitors installed on every computer. So the bosses can, at the end of the day or the week, measure who's been hitting the keyboard the most and who's been slacking off or not doing any typing as a way of measuring productivity. I'm not sure how effective that is, but that's one tool of many. But in the same way as COVID Safe, the app that supposedly is going to save us from complicated tracking, tracing rather than tracking, sorry, in the same way as that is going to be undoubtedly used for other applications, what about some of this other employer-employee monitoring? Does it start to intrude into our private lives as well?
Yeah, I mean, these are exactly the kinds of things that when we think about the changing role of the home and how technology is playing into that, we also have to think about who else is entering our home, right? Our homes are becoming very crowded right now, not only because everyone is at them all the time, but many third parties, our employers, the digital platforms that we now rely on are also in our homes. They're part of our homes and part of our lives in very intimate ways. Mark's question is completely dead on in the sense that this kind of, they're often called productivity tools, which I think is a nice euphemism for this kind of employee monitoring and tracking. But this kind of software is, you can see a sharp uptick in the market of it right now, right? The software is flying off the shelves as a range of companies and sectors are looking for ways to ensure that their employees who are now working at home are being productive or doing their job or not slacking off. And ultimately, just the kind of base level manager wants to know what his or her managees are doing at all times. But these tracking technologies, I think, they're not just the equivalent of having a manager looking over your shoulder in the office. They offer capabilities that are quite different in degree and type. Right? You mentioned, Jon, some of them, such as keystroke logging. There's others that take regular screenshots of your computer and send that to your manager. There's GPS tracking involved. There's a whole range of capabilities that these open up, and that leads to, but it's not only employees or employers that are doing it, but similar types of technologies are being rolled out by some universities, for example, that are using it under the auspices of anti-cheating to ensure that students are not cheating, are doing their schoolwork, or keeping engaged, as well as the range of digital platforms.
Please, students would never.
Sorry. No. Well, yeah, and I think this goes to something too, is that it shows a lack of trust,
Yeah.
right? There's a power dynamic there between employers and employees, between managers and their workers, between universities, administrators, lecturers, and their students, right? There's a power dynamic. And we see that power dynamic reproducing itself, but perhaps in an even more amplified and accelerated way through these technologies. So it really opens up a question of what, with the public health crisis has opened the door for a lot of things that we would otherwise balk at, just a few months ago. But it opens up a question of what we're now saddled with becomes normal, right? In a few months' time, after we've all gotten used to these kinds of technologies, will they just become normal? Will they become a part of our everyday life? And then, then they just kind of keep rolling on. That's oftentimes how these technologies do become part of how we live, and they become part of the futures that we're creating right now.
All right, or is it just novelty value? That's a really interesting point. We'll get the conversation broadening out in a moment. There's some great questions coming through. Angela says one of the reasons she thinks working from home is working well is because everyone's doing it. But what happens when half the workforce is in the office and other people are consigned? Is it a hierarchy? You're told, well, you're working from home. And how do you make those decisions? And what impact does that have? It's a really interesting point that Angela raises, Jathan. So does that come down to, well, the tech savvy people can work from home and the people who aren't tech savvy or don't have, as we heard before, perhaps the setup or the facilities, they can come and work in the office? Has anyone given much thought to any of this?
There's definitely equity issues at play here, and it's not only the technological that's part of it, but it's also just the kind of social and family conditions that we all work and go to school in, right? Because we also have to think about not only working from home, but going to school from home, learning from home.
Yep.
I mean, that's very difficult for a lot of people, not only if they don't have the high bandwidth internet or the right kinds of devices, but if their home life is not conducive to that kind of working and learning for whatever reason, there's definitely equity issues at play. And there's issues that we do have to think about, again, that question of what becomes normalized, what precedents are we setting now, and what can be expected of us in the future. If it comes to show that we can work productively and learn productively from home, will the expectation then be that that's what we do from now on, right? So you see companies like Twitter, these kind of, often tech companies, but really kind of office-based companies. But Twitter was in the news for saying that their employees are now allowed to work from home indefinitely. And the subtext there is almost that they're expected to work from home indefinitely. So that, I think that opens up a lot of questions as well of what happens with our urban landscapes, our city landscapes, as office buildings sit empty or restaurants sit empty, right? There's all these flow-on effects from these technological choices that we're having to make now because we see no other alternative. But they don't just at some point switch off and then we go back to what it was before. There's going to be these long-lasting flow-on effects.
Okay, I've got more questions and I'll get to them in just a moment, and I'll get back to Sarah and Yolande as well. But Jathan, before we do that, let's not be naive about this. A lot of this is not driven by what's in the best interests of the workers or what's in the best interests of anybody except the business and what's best for the bottom line. Bosses will sense an opportunity to say, hang on, one of the biggest components of overhead that I deal with here in my business, whether it's a services business, whether it's a bank or a law firm or a medical practice or insurance brokers, anything you care to think of, one of your biggest costs is real estate. Paying for rent, paying for floor space, and paying for the maintenance and the upkeep of it and everything that comes from it. And if I can save money, I'm going to do so. And if technology, and there's a lot of companies that are going to make a lot of money by providing platforms, virtual platforms and software that will replace real estate. In the same way as we'd never heard of Facebook or Amazon, a decade or so ago, most of us, it's now become ubiquitous. It's become just seamlessly part of everyday life. do you anticipate that there will be new emerging platforms that will start to be just part and parcel, seamlessly integrated into our working future?
I mean, the short answer is yes, because there's already new platforms constantly trying to become seamlessly part of the way that we work and live and all of that. And this links very much up to a lot of my work does look at the smart city, as it's called, and the kind of changes in city life through technologies. And pre-pandemic, I was already seeing this trajectory, this trend towards digital platforms taking over increasingly more and more parts of urban governance, urban services, right? Having a foothold in urban space and society in really core and crucial ways. And we can't ignore the fact that right now, in just sheer economic and market terms, the sector that is absolutely thriving in the midst of the pandemic is the technology platform services, right? It's the Amazons, it's the Deliveroos, it's it's the platforms. Those are the companies that are thriving right now, and so they're consolidating, right? And so it is naive to think that they won't continue to exercise that power, continue to expand, as is a mandate, a core part of their business model. So I think the question now is, again, what kind of futures are we seeing actively being created, and who's the one creating them, and how are they being framed, right? How are these trade-offs being framed? How are solutions and alternatives and possibilities or not being framed? And I think that's something that, while for many of us, while we're trying to get through a crisis, there are definitely a lot of actors out there, a lot of companies out there and so on, who are seeing an opportunity while we're in the midst of a crisis. And I think that's something we really have to key in on, as they are the ones designing and implementing the kinds of technologies that we're talking about right now.
In fact, that wonderful phrase, never waste a crisis. When you get an opportunity, don't waste it. So Sarah, what we're seeing here is a race, are we not? A race for people developing product, software, hardware, whatever it might be. Apparently, some of the shops that sell this stuff are going through enormous explosions in demand. You know, you queue up to get into Officeworks, not just because of social distancing, but because everybody needs suddenly all the home office equipment and the like. So what do you think is likely to become indispensable? What is likely to be the new normal as we get to whatever it is this settles down to be?
I think that what we need to remember is it's not only companies that innovate. It's not only companies that use a crisis moment to try to kind of take advantage of a new situation. Everybody innovates, people innovate. Everyday life is ongoing innovation. So humans adapt and find ways in which to achieve what they need and to meet their own priorities in everyday life context with the resources that are available. So I guess I want to say that in a way to kind of counter the kind of argument that the companies are going to actually kind of take control of what we're buying, what we're doing, how we're using technologies, and the impact that technologies have on us, and ask, well, how is it that people will actually be able to take advantage of these new technologies to achieve those things that they really want to do in everyday life, maybe in slightly different ways to the ways that they did before? So yes, some platforms will become incredibly useful to people, but that might not mean that just because you're using a digital platform to communicate in a work context now during the COVID crisis, it doesn't, and you continue to use that platform, and it does become embedded in your everyday life. And yes, that organisation who produced that has created a great opportunity for itself. But you won't necessarily be using it all the time. You will embed it in your life in such a way that works for you as you move forward. And so after the COVID crisis, then what I imagine is going to happen is that people are going to appropriate those technologies and use them in ways that are particularly useful for them.
Well, look at what we're doing right now, Yolande. We're using something to conduct a conversation. Participants from all over the world, potentially and realistically, not just in our own city, can all join in a conversation about something because of a platform, Zoom, that by and large was regarded as a bit of a toy until now, and now it's become a business essential.
It has. Zoom has just absolutely exploded everywhere. It's yeah, I think we're all experiencing the Zoom fatigue as well that comes with that sort of moment. I also just wanted to pick up on something Jathan was sort of hinting at in terms of these companies sort of entering our lives, and link that to some of my own work, because the smart wife isn't just about sort of making products that fill a gap, the wife gap, or the wife drought, as Annabelle Crabbs called it. It's also about using feminine form to make something acceptable, to make something likable, and to, you know, encourage more and more people to use that. And, you know, that is not necessarily an inherently bad thing. You know, it's nice to use things that we all like and are familiar with, but there are a few issues with that. One is around the perpetuation of stereotypes around women sort of doing all those wifely jobs in the home, and basically enshrining that in a device that speaks like a woman, and sometimes even looks like a woman. But also it speaks to the concerns that Jathan's talking to us about. So the security, the kind of hidden agendas that might come with some of these technologies as well, because they're in this, you know, kind of friendly feminine form, we're more kind of willing to overlook and maybe more willing to accept these technologies into our lives. And then, as Sarah says, you know, we appropriate them into many, you know, useful tasks, like getting Alexa to put the stove, or telling us what the weather is, or playing us songs, and doing all these really great, you know, useful things. But that's not to say there's still not another agenda that's kind of coming in with that Alexa still doesn't want to sell us something or get us to use some sort of platform. So I think it's actually kind of this tension between the two kind of things, you know, of people appropriating and making these things useful in their lives, but still this kind of external influence coming into the home as well, with its own agenda, and trying to kind of get us to do certain things in a way that suits a company's interest.
Let's whip around the three of you, but starting with you, Yolande. There's nothing new about talking about the digital divide, people who are with the tech and people who are not with the tech, but there's actually there's a no man's land or no person's land in between. People who are kind of okay but not expert, and increasingly what we're seeing is that someone who's very tech savvy is leaving everyone else behind, and then who's left behind is not just the people who are refuseniks or people who just don't get it or can't get it if they've got some particular intellectual or physical disability, but there's also people who are okay with the basics, but they're scared of when it goes further. So we're now getting digital hierarchies, not just a have and have not, but more subtle variations there as well. Sure, the technology's got easy to use, but increasingly we're seeing this polarization. What impact do you think that's going to have on the workplace, and what impact it's going to have at home, especially, and it's almost inevitably generational?
Absolutely, but I don't kind of see it quite as black and white as that. I think that this pandemic has actually provided a very big, strong motivation for many people to improve their digital skills where they can. Obviously, not everybody's been able to do that, and certainly there is a digital divide, and it's growing. But we should kind of resist, I guess, assumptions about who might be more impacted than others. I mean, for instance, we're involved in a project at the moment with Clean Care and Deakin University, which has been giving smart home technologies to older people. And the improvisation and the kind of the level of skill development that project has shown amongst that sort of generation has been really fantastic. So it's, you know, I think that if people have those opportunities, if they do have access to the technology, and obviously not everyone does, then we can start to improve some of those digital divides, and this pandemic has in a way kind of provided the impetus for that to start to occur. There's also been a number of programs I've noticed where schools and tech companies have been giving away devices, particularly to people from lower socioeconomic groups, to try and bridge that divide where students may, for example, have not had access to technologies previously. It comes with its own problems, like Jathan's been talking about, because then that's kind of more tech in the home, and there are impacts of that as well. But yeah, I think that the impacts are still quite unevenly experienced here, and some people are benefiting with the crisis, and others maybe not so much.
Sure, and Jathan, the digital divide, but just ST sent in, often your team members have various family commitments. If working from home, they may have to spend more time taking care of children or elderly parents while juggling work, and it impacts on your team performance. It's difficult to raise this up because of the sensitivity of the matter. So any thoughts or suggestions, if you want to work that in as we go through the conversation as well. But the fairness, the equity, the digital divide and the polarisation that's taking place, what are your thoughts?
Sure, and just speaking to that, and you know the digital skills hierarchy, but also speaking to Sarah's point as well, that it's for sure true that people will appropriate these technologies and use them for their own purposes. You know, there will be people who will hack them in various ways, so that to kind of take advantage of them to reshape them for their own purposes and values. But at the same time, I do think that there is a divide in the ability and skill of people to be able to appropriate and hack these technologies, which are designed for one purpose, and then appropriate them for another purpose. And instead, I wonder how we might think about these technologies as designed with different hierarchies of values and priorities in mind, right? So thinking about the employee monitoring software rather than control being the primary value. What about compassion, right? What would a productivity tool designed for compassion look like? And that gets to the point that the questioner raised as well of, rather than trying to think about how we use these technologies to replicate previous modes of working and learning and relating and housework and so on, just to be able to replicate them, why not use these technologies to radically rethink how they might work, right? So why not think about working from home in a more kind of fluid way, a more compassionate way, rather than this way that is still very much kind of enthralled to the 9 to 5, 8 hours straight of productivity with no interruptions. That's just not feasible in a realistic way.
But who's going to spend millions of dollars investing in a technology and a platform that you're then wanting to recover your investment by selling it? And the selling point is that you're being nice. Hey.
And this gets exactly at Sarah's point as well, that more people than just corporations innovate. It's very possible for others to innovate. And I think what we need is to look at other forms and other sources of innovation and other people involved in this innovation. I call it in my own recent book that just came out called Too Smart, I call this democratizing innovation, because right now we see a kind of oligarchy or an elite class of people that have the skills and the funds to kind of drive what innovation looks like, rather than a more democratic form of innovation, which uses perhaps government or perhaps social investment to include a wider variety of people, a wider variety of voices and values in these decisions, so we can see technologies that contribute to compassion rather than contribute to the bottom line.
Sarah, on the digital divide?
On the digital divide, I think that Yolande and Jathan have probably said most of it, I guess, especially as regards Australia. I think I would just remind everyone that we live in a very big world, and we have differing, and within Australia as well, people have very varied access to digital infrastructures and housing infrastructures as well, if we want to think about how people live in homes across the world. So let's also recognise that those kinds of inequalities are very uneven, but they're global. And here we're actually extremely privileged in terms of the access that we do have.
I'm going to wrap a couple of questions, and feel free to send in more. We've got another, 10, 15 minutes or so we can squeeze some more in. But there's a number of people who have sent in questions that I'll wrap in together because they're on similar themes. And it's to do really with physical arrangements. Tom says, if proximity to the physical workplace is no longer a significant factor, then businesses consider whether they move to smaller premises, but even remote premises. Other people are saying, well, suddenly your dream of living down the coast and still being able to work, not having to go into the office, becomes a reality. You can do your sea change, tree change. So Sarah, just staying with you for a moment, do you think some of these changes, they'll have impact, and then they have major economic impact, not just family life, social life and the like, but there's economic impact? We need to improve regional internet services for a start straight away, but that changes what infrastructure you need. It changes people's commuting patterns if they're not if they're telecommuting realistically instead of just being an ideal and a remote ideal that has been for decades.
Yeah, I mean, it completely kind of changes the needs that we have in terms of the roads infrastructures, transport infrastructures, as well as the working from home and digital infrastructures, because I think it's hard to imagine people only working remotely, and people will still need to travel, but they will need to travel in different ways. And that could be very beneficial in terms of the way that public transport systems and car ownership systems work in city centres at the moment, whereas we know there's lots of congestion and lots of concern about that. I mean, I think this also connects to the whole question of the relationship between potential changes in the way that we live and work in our homes, and also potential future mobilities and automobility changes, and also thinking around both of those contexts as being framed by the future possibilities offered by modes of automation.
Yep.
The same questions around data, the collection of data about what people are doing, the kinds of transport options people use, the tracking that's involved in that as well. So we're kind of dealing with many of the same questions, which once you start to reconfigure where people live, where they work, then they all kind of cascade onto all of the other things that we do in everyday life as well. So it really means for me, it means we need a whole rethink. And it relates to what Jathan was saying about the way that we design technology. So Jathan was saying, maybe start with compassion. I would say, yes, that's completely right. I mean, the way I would put it is to start with the ethics. Technology design is very often thought out in terms of the engineering feat is kind of accomplished. We have this amazing new technology which can be launched into society. And then the ethicists and the regulators have to come in afterwards and sort it out. And going back to what Yolande is saying, that's a very gendered model as well. It's often, thinking about these very masculine innovations, which then the kind of more feminine sciences and have to come in and kind of sort out the mess later so it can really be used in society. So let's rethink all of that and start again with putting ethics first.
Alrighty, thank you, Sarah. We've still got another 10 minutes, but there's lots of things coming through and we're not going to get to deal with all of them. We'll deal with as many as we can. Yolande, can we address some of the unconscious bias? And Nick has sent in a really good question about the unconscious bias that's just designed in to algorithms. There's discrimination against minority groups. You've already talked about gender aspects. How unconsciously biased is an algorithm?
It's a great question. I would say quite significantly unconsciously, but although it's also consciously biased because an algorithm is designed by somebody, and we often forget that. And that like Sarah was saying, this is also gendered because the industries that are typically designing algorithms and making these kinds of devices are more dominated by men. So there's been a lot of criticism of algorithms. I'm sure everybody's heard various stories about this. Even Google search engines being biased around the types of sort of information that they're prepared to disclose to people, whether they even understand things like, abortion, for example. There was a big kind of scandal around that with Apple a number of years ago, and its ability to even recognise what that word meant and send people to the right places when they were seeking help for things like that. So there's a whole raft of issues, and I think it does come back to the diversity of the industry that's actually responsible for designing and programming these machines. This is another area too, John, where the smart wife kind of idea gets a bit muddled, because typically when something goes wrong with Alexa or Siri or any of these other kind of digital women that we have hanging around, we blame them and we say, oh, silly Alexa, or, stupid Siri. But so we blame it on a woman, which is also really problematic, right? Because when you come back to who the majority of the industry is who sits behind this, it's a very kind of good little scapegoat. So I think that's where I unconscious bias, I'm not sure. I think maybe the unconsciousness comes from us as users, not kind of recognising the industries and the people that actually sit behind these technologies and do make decisions, and sometimes overlook things and do have their own biases, of course, as well. But certainly sometimes those decisions are quite deliberate as well as unconscious.
All right, and I'll come to Jathan on that, but I'll just read Mary's question. And in essence, what she says is we need to acknowledge not all women are safe at home either. and that presents other issues. Sarah says telehealth may be an ongoing and valid part of primary healthcare after the pandemic. Does it represent a return to the idea of a house call in the old days, but now it's just being done by the adaptation rather, of the new technology? And Melissa has written in, besides the space aspects of working from home, how are the experiences of time, the concept of time, changing too, as work days of the week, family schedules, weekends, everything overlaps now? Are we reinventing time and changing its role in our lives? And that's a really interesting, almost, Melissa, the starting point for another whole discussion, but sadly we've only got a few minutes left in this one. Jathan, on the issues that we were just addressing with Sarah and Yolande and the unconscious bias of an algorithm.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Yolande and Sarah have said, although I would like to push it even further. You know, the discourse around the kind of implicit biases and unconscious bias has been going on for so long and has long escaped the kind of the niche conversations of academic discussion, right? There's been articles, it's been part in the news, it's now mainstream to understand that these technologies, the data, the algorithms, and so on, have these implicit biases, unconscious biases in them, that I would go so far as to say that I think framing them as implicit or unconscious gives an undue pass to a lot of these designers and a lot of these companies, right? Because if you say it's implicit or if it's unconscious, then they say in return, oops, you know, it snuck in there. I didn't know. It's the flaws of being human. But they do know, right? At this point, it has to be willful ignorance or malpractice to allow those kinds of biases to continue to be rampant and buried inside of the technologies, when the solutions for excavating those biases or not putting them in there in the first place are well known and well discussed on this panel already. And so I think we as users and as a society, you know, we can't rely on them on the kind of that self-regulation. And we can't, and at least I would say we can't allow that kind of easy mea culpa to be sufficient anymore. We have to push them to do better, or else, I mean, or else harder regulations, harder policies that kind of enforce it if that kind of unconsciousness or implicitness continues to sneak its way into our technologies.
Okay, I want to whip round the panel on two things, and it's prompted, one of them is prompted by Neil's question, which is about climate change and the environment. If digital technology might be part of the answer, we are very wasteful. And I see Sarah is framed beautifully, of course, by a vista of renewable energy and endless wind power. How might the climate emergency, as it emerges now, merged with the pandemic emergency in the post-COVID-19 world, how might they either collide or cooperate in reshaping our world? Sarah?
I think they both need to contribute to the way that our possible future worlds are being imagined, designed, planned for. You know, they have kind of intersecting complexities because, you know, more working from home, more use of digital technology will require more data storage, it will require energy. So in a sense, we are still depleting the environment, but in new ways, through our new kind of world of using digital technology much more. So I think there's some very kind of careful high-level analysis of the data and the statistics and what's actually happening in these different flows of data, energy, technology. What about the minerals that are mined for the production of these technologies? You know, I mean, there's a very kind of complex and embedded system through which our environment is being ruined by the production and use of digital technologies, whilst at the same time, obviously it's being reported that there have been great benefits to the environment and to climate.
Or just all the aeroplanes that aren't flying in the factories that are pumping out all the muck and all the rest of it. Sure. I'll come back to you for a concluding remark in a moment, but Yolande, just on the collision of pandemic and post-pandemic changes with the climate emergency, your views?
This is something that I've done quite a lot of research on in terms of the impact of technology on the environment, particularly smart home technologies and their impact on energy demand. And we're all actually working on a project around this topic at the moment as well. I guess the fundamental problem for me that it tends to undermine the environmental benefits of these kinds of devices is that most technologies don't come into the home just to save energy or just to provide some sort of environmental benefit. They also provide a range of other new sort of lifestyle improvements, if you like. They provide convenience, they provide extra entertainment, they provide extra comfort. And so one of the things that I've consistently seen in my research is that we actually kind of ratchet up our expectations for how we want to live in our homes and the kinds of expectations we have around comfort and convenience, for example. And that adds an extra environmental burden or energy burden to our homes that can undermine some of the savings or the efficiency benefits that might come from these technologies. So that I think we have to consider how these technologies that are intended to save energy or the environmental benefits they might provide, how they can also change our lives in ways that will result in us using more resources. And then there's also as Sarah was mentioning, the e-waste, the production kind of product problems with a lot of these devices, and the data centres that are now required to provide, and they're using huge amounts of energy, as much as the airline industry or more now, just to provide the content to our devices. So lots of considerations there, I think, to weigh up.
To grease the digital wheels. Briefly, Jathan, because then I've got one quick concluding round of everybody and we're just about out of time. If people are needing to leave, before we do our concluding remarks, I do want to encourage you to complete the survey, the evaluation survey. It's really important for the evolution of these new ways. It's putting in practice exactly what we're talking about. And if you're enjoying this, or if you think there are some changes you'd like to see introduced, please use the evaluation form survey that's part and parcel of it all and let us know what you think. Jathan, just briefly as we whip around one more time.
No, I agree with everything that Yolande and Sarah said. And I think it's one thing to just really emphasize that the data centers are immensely energy intensive. The amount of energy input and emissions output of training an artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithm is absolutely shocking when you look at the numbers. And the dangerous part there is that a lot of this energy usage is invisible to us, right? It's invisible in the way we talk about it as the cloud computing and so on, the immaterial. And I think we really need to understand these digital technologies as so material and so embedded into the environmental and ecological context.
All right, and just briefly, are you an optimist or a pessimist, Jathan?
I'm a realist, John. Always a realist.
You're avoiding me. It's a very dangerous fence that you're trying to balance on. Which side do you fall on? Jathan, optimism or pessimism? Which way do you fall?
Well, no one has ever accused me of being an optimist, so I'll leave it at that.
All right, Yolande?
Is this like just generally in life, John? Or because I think generally I'm quite an optimistic person.
No, about the technology and the impact and the changes that we've been talking about, homework, striking a balance, finding a new normal.
I think like Jathan, see, this is the thing, we try and resist these dystopian or utopian perspectives and try and sit a little bit more in the middle. I don't know, I guess I'd be more on the dystopian side as well, if I had to choose.
That's 2 from 3, Sarah. Which way do you go?
Well, look, the world is not heading in a very good direction. But likewise, I don't think we should think in terms of the dystopian or the utopian. I think for me, the key thing I usually say is actually the future is going to be just as interesting and boring as the present. And thinking of the future in terms of the spectacular, the world crumbling or everything being amazing is not really going to help us. What we need to think about is how we're going to get done the things that everybody wants to get done in their everyday lives and to generate that kind of what Jathan was saying, compassion. I was saying like ethics. And how do we generate a future where those things underpin our values rather than worrying about the spectacular end or beginning?
I'm a great fan of the French economist Thomas Piketty, who says that capitalism has an almost endless ability to reinvent itself, to adapt, and to take into account the challenges that it's facing. It's been fascinating. Can we thank Penny, Trent, or all the people behind the scenes who have worked so hard to pull this program and the entire series together? It's been absolutely wonderful. To each of you, thank you very, very much. To Sarah Pink, Yolande Strengers, Jathan Sadowski, thank you very, very much. Do fill in your evaluation forms. Let us know what you think. And I hope you've enjoyed this Monash Tech Talk about the changing role of home during the crisis. And I hope you'll join in next time around as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.